Welcome to our last unit of the year, evolution. This is going to be a very quick, very kind of down to the bones evolution. I've cut out a lot for the amount of allow for the amount of time that we have left to really hit the important points. So lecture 1 today is all about the theory of Darwin's theory of natural selection. So, how populations evolve. Notice it says here populations. It does not say individuals. Individuals do not evolve. Single organisms cannot evolve. Only a population can evolve. An individual is born with the genetic makeup it already has. It's not going to create new genetics in the middle of its life. Okay? So only the population can actually change. So the theory is that the change of a population's genetic makeup over many generations. The general idea of it is that there are certain individuals in the population that are able to survive over others. Those individuals that survive, they do so because they have certain variable traits. And then those favorable traits are passed on to more offspring because those organisms are surviving. So that's the basic idea of natural selection. I'm going to go through real quick the 4 basic tenets or principles of how this actually occurs. So Charles Darwin, a little background on him first. When he was young, he was a naturalist. He was on a ship called the HMS Beagle. They stopped at the Galapagos Islands. They're a relatively young chain of volcanic islands, kind of like Hawaii. It's called an archipelago. And while he was on the island, Darwin noticed that there were specific birds, these finches, that lived on the island. They resembled birds that he saw on the mainland of South America. But the main difference is that all of these birds had very similar body structures. So they looked like the same bird, except they all had different beaks. And he noticed that their beaks were linked to the kind of food that they were eating. So there were some finches that had large, wide beaks that were good for crushing large seeds, and there were some with smaller beaks that were good for crushing small seeds, and there were some that were really long and pointy that were good for digging in the ground, looking for grub and insects and things like that. There was a finch with a kind of a hooked beak that was good for eating meat, so that that finch was probably feeding on things like mice, smaller mammals. So what he surmised from that was that based on the area that those finches were living in, there were certain beaks that were favorable to that particular spot, and those particular finches survived, passed those genes on, and eventually what happened is that they all became separate species. So those finches could no longer reproduce together. They actually became different things altogether. So how this happens. So there are, like I said, there's 4 tenets. So the first thing that Darwin proposed was something called descent with modification, and then he later modified that based on other information information that he got later. So, number 1, the first tenet of natural selection is that organisms produce many offspring. Most of the time, I know it says sometimes, but most of the time more than the environment can hold. It's something called overproduction. So from the beginning, there's already too many organisms that are going to survive. So some are going to die. Because some are going to die, that leads to competition among the members of the same species. They're competing for food, they're competing for space, they're competing for water, mates, all of this competition, because it's known that not all of them are going to survive. Number 2, variation. Not all organisms are identical. Identical twins are identical, but within members of a population, those individual organisms are going to have slightly differing traits. Variation is caused by mutations, which happens rarely. Mutations are actually not very common. and sexual reproduction. So we're talking about sexual reproduction. Remember, we're talking about fusion of gametes. So the sperm and the egg coming together, the mother, the father, they're both contributing, and also crossing over. So that's when the chromosomes themselves can actually switch segments during meiosis 1. And then you also have independent assortment. The chromosomes lining up randomly. Those terms should all be familiar from when we talked about mitosis and meiosis. Crossing over, independent assortment, fusion of gametes, those are all sources of variation. That's why children are not identical to their parents. They're a combination of those genes. Now, because of those variations, some organisms might be better able to survive in a particular environment than others. Okay, it's called a reproductive advantage or an adaptive advantage. Okay, so some of them are better equipped to deal with their environments than others, which means they are going to adapt to those changes more efficiently. They are going to be able to survive and reproduce, which passes on their genes, which means that their particular variations are going to be passed on. So it's increasing something called fitness. And when we're talking about fitness, I'm not talking about how in shape somebody is or how, no. What I'm talking about is the ability to survive, and here's the big one, reproduce. Because an organism could live to be 500 years old. But if that organism cannot reproduce, it does not have any fitness because it's not able to pass on those traits to a later generation. So we've got overcompetition, so we've got overproduction, we've got variation, we've got adaptive advantage, so increased fitness, and then we have actual survival of the fittest. The struggle for survival means that the organisms that are best able to survive are going to pass on those traits, and then those traits are going to increase within the population. So over the course of many generations, what happens is those unfavorable traits will slowly begin to weed out because they're not passing on those traits as much to offspring. They're not surviving as long. Whereas the ones with the really favorable traits are going to continue passing on those genes to offspring, which means those traits are going to increase within the population. There's going to be more of them. So let's take this from, let's talk about a giraffe. An ancient giraffe, or an ancestor of a giraffe. So it wasn't a giraffe, but an ancestor of a giraffe. Let's say they had much shorter necks than current giraffes have. Okay, so there's an overproduction, meaning not as many of these ancestors of giraffes. There's a whole bunch of them that are not going to survive. They know that right off the bat. Okay, there is variation. Some have longer necks than others. And the ones that have longer necks are able to reach higher in the trees to get their food, which means they are much more able to survive than the ones with shorter necks. So that is the adaptive advantage. They can reach higher, they get more food, they're more likely to survive, which means the ones with shorter necks, they might be dying of starvation. The ones with longer necks are surviving. And then because they are surviving, they are able to pass down their genes, and that means that maybe more of the next generation are going to have longer necks, and then more of the next generation will have longer necks. And that happens over many generations until that ancestor of the giraffe has at some point evolved into the current giraffes that we see today with the very, very, very long necks. So that is the theory of natural selection. Your assignment today is to complete the natural selection gizmo that is posted in the day 1 folder. And next class, we will move on to evidence for evolution.